point, let me share with you my honest thoughts on the TTArtisan 75mm f2 autofocus lens, which TTArtisan kindly sent me for free to play around with and review for you guys. So first of all, in terms of focal length, this is a 75mm lens, which is going to be great for like portraits, product shots, and even landscapes. Personally, I like shooting landscapes with a semi-telephoto lens like this because I like to focus on the details of the location rather than just using a wide angle focal length and then seeing the entire location. So if you want to isolate your subject from the background or you want to focus on the details of the environment, this is definitely a great focal length to consider. Now, if you wonder how it compares to something like an 85mm focal length, which is a bit more traditional, honestly, the difference is negligible. Yes, there is some difference if you put them side by side, but it's not as significant as, for example, going from like a 24mm lens to 35mm. Now, in terms of the overall design, this lens has a very minimal design, as you can see. It's very compact, weighs about 330 grams. The build quality is fantastic. It's made entirely of metal, including the lens mount, which is great. It uses a 62mm filter thread. It comes with this funny looking lens hood. I guess they wanted to make the lens, look more vintagey in a way. Also, the lens cap it comes with is a bit noisy and kind of sticky. Still works just fine. It's just not as smooth as a lens cap from Sony, for example, which doesn't make any noise and also is very easy to press. Next, the bottom lens cap has electronics inside and a USB-C port to update the firmware on the lens. I'm not sure why TTArtisan decided to put the USB-C port on this lens cap instead of just putting it on the lens itself like most third-party manufacturers do. If I had to guess, it's probably because of weather sealing, although this lens is not really weather sealed. But one thing to consider is that if you are going to lose this lens cap, you will not be able to update the firmware on the lens. So if you are going to buy this lens, I would, open it up, take out the lens cap, put it somewhere in the corner, somewhere where you'll remember what it is, and then just use a traditional, plastic lens cap from Sony or whatever. And then when you do need to upgrade the firmware, you can take it out, put it on the lens, plug it to your computer and update the firmware. Moving on, the focus ring is very smooth and it doesn't make any noises whatsoever. This lens doesn't have any autofocus manual focus switch or a function button. However, it does have an aperture ring with clicks. It's like a clicky aperture ring. This is how it sounds like. However, a couple of things to consider with this aperture ring. First of all, when you're going from the maximum aperture of f16 to A to be able to control the aperture from the camera, it's a bit too easy to do. There's like barely any resistance compared to, for example, my Sony lens. If I'm going from the maximum aperture of f22 to A, there is some resistance to it. And this is to make sure that you don't accidentally, when the lens is in your bag, it's going to switch from f22 to A. And this is something that happened to me a lot with the TTArtisan lens. I would put it to A, control the aperture from the camera, and then I would put it in the bag, take it out again, and I would see that it's set to f16. And also when you switch from f16 to A, it takes good 5-6 seconds to be able to actually control the aperture from the camera. Whereas, for example, with my Sony lens, when I switch from f22 to A, instantaneously I can control the aperture on the camera. But again, with this lens, I have to wait like 5-6 seconds. And in some occasions when shooting with this lens, I actually lost the moment because I was waiting for the lens to register on the camera or whatever it is. I'm not sure if it's because my camera is not really compatible with this lens. I'm using the Sony ZV-E1, or maybe because this lens is cheap, they're just using cheap electronics and it just takes a bit more time than, more expensive Sony lenses. Now, moving on to autofocus, I think this lens performs really well, except for when shooting in high contrast scenes or when you are going to like backlight your subject. Sometimes in those conditions, I noticed that it produces focus hunting, focus pulsing, or whatever it is. It's not like deadlocked on the subject like with a native Sony lens. However, in most, like 90% of scenarios, it performed just as well as a native Sony lens. It's just that when you're really pushing it to the extreme, it's not going to be as sticky as a native Sony lens. But for the most part, I think it performs more than good enough, especially for just $200. Now, in terms of the optical performance, I think for just $200, this lens performs really well. When shooting wide open, it's going to be sharp in the center or where you're going to set the focus to, but you will notice some vignetting and also soft corners and some minor chromatic aberration issues when shooting in high contrast scenes. But when stopping down to about f4, f5.6, the image is pretty much going to be tack sharp across the entire frame with no visible vignetting and no chromatic aberration issues. Again, for $200, it is not terrible, but it's definitely not like mind-blowing. For example, the Yongnuo 85mm 1.8 lens I've reviewed a couple of months ago, something like that, was really mind-blowing, especially for the price of just $300. That lens was like really sharp at f1.8, and this one is sharp, but it's not like mind-blowingly sharp when shooting wide open at f2, but it is not terrible. It's still really good, as you saw from the footage I've shared throughout this video. Also, this lens has like a vintage vibe slash character to it. It looks like old school in a way. It reminds me of the Zeiss 55mm f1.8 lens in a way, which also has like a vintage vibe to it. So if you want something that looks a bit more old school, a bit more like soft, that has some character to it, this is definitely a lens to consider. Overall, for $200, I think this lens is fantastic. It's really compact, has fantastic build quality. The autofocus performs relatively well if you're not using it in high contrast scenes a lot. The image quality is great, especially if you want some character to your image. And overall, I would highly recommend this lens if you want to experiment with this kind of a focal length. Honestly, if you want something that is better than this and it's close to this price point, check out the Yongnuo 85mm 1.8. That lens, I believe, is like $300, but I think it's worth the money. And in my opinion, it's much better than this lens because of how mind-blowingly sharp it is when shooting wide open at f1.8. Regardless, I'm going to leave links for this lens down below, and if you have any questions or comments and whatnot, also let me know down below, and I guess I'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.